Good morning, Year 10, and here is your chapter rundown of Chapter 3 of The Woman in Black. So, the journey north. Things to look out for. The journey north. Not a journey north. This one starts with the definite article, the determiner, the. This is a specific, a named, a particular and important journey, and a singular one. The implication here is that Arthur, once he's made this journey, is not going to come back to this place if he ever escapes from it. And, well, actually, that's reasonably accurate, as you'll see later on, but it's really important. There are holes in the plot of The Woman in Black, and actually, when you read Susan Hill's own introduction to the novel, she admits that she focuses much more on atmosphere than she does on plot, and we can kind of see that with some of the maths of the ages of the people involved. It doesn't quite stack up, and details like that. But that doesn't detract from the quality of the narrative and the style. And in particular, she's very focused on detail. So this detail here, the, is really, really important. So let's start by having a look at what does this chapter do? Well, this chapter takes Arthur away from the safety of London, and it starts with a journey that begins somewhere pleasant, or begins somewhere unpleasant, but starts pleasantly. So the journey begins in King's Cross, and the description of King's Cross is, again, echoing the descriptions of London from the previous chapter. It's hellish. There's smoke and fire and brimstone, and it really is almost like an image from Dante. And you get this picture being built up in the mind of the character, which almost justifies his reasons for leaving. But then when we get on the train, we see that Arthur's excited. He's excited by the idea of traveling, and he gets in there and he feels, once he's on and he shuts the door, he feels it's almost like a little library in a restaurant as it's traveling along. And we get this focus on a technique, actually, you'll see quite a lot through the novel, where Arthur has a good meal on board the train and it makes him feel a lot better. And you'll see Susan Hill ties feelings to food, because food can be directly comfort. We even talk about the idea of comfort food, and we'll come to that in the next chapter, specifically where we see that being used quite a lot. And you'll see it's often used to, along with the weather, to manipulate the atmosphere and to kind of show the changes in Arthur's feelings, or at least influence perhaps some of Arthur's feelings and how they might change. So the journey's comfortable to begin with, but then it begins to get less comfortable until finally, on the very last train, Arthur is the sole passenger until he meets a significant character. And guys, here's the thing to look out for. When you meet a character in The Woman in Black, it's really worth making as much note of them as you can, writing as many things down, identifying things that they say, because there aren't very many people in this book, and the ones that we meet are all significant. And Mr. Daley is probably, to my mind, the second most important character that Arthur meets beyond the Woman in Black, who you could argue maybe isn't actually a character, but in terms of other people with whom Arthur interacts, Mr. Daley is probably the most important character that he interfaces with, for a variety of reasons. Mr. Daley does a few things. He kind of hints. It does what you'll see lots of the characters doing. They say, "Oh, there's something terrible," and they hint at the mystery that Arthur is walking into, but they won't actually explain anything to him about it. Arthur's reaction to Mr. Daley is quite interesting. He judges Mr. Daley on his appearance. Talks about him having looking brash, as if he's just come into money, and he's not afraid to show it. We later learn there's a little bit more to Mr. Daley than that. This chapter is really significant because it is the move where Arthur is taken from what we later learn is the safety of London, the urban environment that he knows well, into the wild and unknown lands of the north. And we are kind of wrong-footed. Again, this is another example of Susan Hill keeping us off balance, in that firstly we travel seemingly up the west coast of the country, and then we cut across the land to go right the way to the east coast. So we're kind of we're we're disconnected from the geography. We can't place where Eelmarsh House is supposed to be, which is exactly what Susan Hill's trying to do. So we can't pin it down and go, oh, that place, well, that wouldn't have, we're trying to create, it's a fantasy. It is a story. And she grounds it with just enough reality for us to go, that sounds believable, but then obfuscates when and where this takes place to make it, to allow her to play with these fantastical events, the ghost story, and all of these fictional things. She strikes a nice fine balance between realism and this fantasy world of the ghost story that she builds. Arthur is introduced to Mr. Daley, and Mr. Daley's name is interesting. I said before in some of the earlier videos that names are important. Drab, Low, Eelmarsh, but Mr. Daley, again, this indicates a sort of a down-to-earth nature, someone who's not easily taken in by superstition. So when he shows that he is cautious and very serious about the affairs at Eelmarsh House, it's a real signal that we and Arthur should also be. Arthur, of course, ignores him because he's from London and he knows better. So techniques, we see the pathetic fallacy being trotted out here as per. We see warnings being given, foreshadowing, and actually it's specific foreshadowing of events that occur in chapter 6. I'll say no more until you've read that. And obviously, if you've read the book already and you're using this for revision, you'll know precisely what this links to. And again, the place names are there. So we are introduced to Gapemouth Tunnel, and Arthur even comments he's come to the land of curious place names, Eelmarsh House, Gapemouth Tunnel. One other thing to notice is Gapemouth Tunnel is interesting. The incident where the train comes to a stop and actually Arthur and Samuel Daley are sat on the train and there's no noise other than the wind is because there's only one train line in and one train line out. Yet another example of how physically isolated Arthur is once he gets to Crith and Gifford. The trains have to wait for each other to pass. And the train that comes away from Crith and Gifford, Arthur notes at some point in this chapter that there's absolutely nobody on it. And there's only him and Samuel Daley on the train going to Crith and Gifford. Something that really should be a bit of a warning. Nobody, you'll never leave. So let's go and have a look at some key quotations. There are a few key quotations in a relatively short chapter. So this one, I've picked out 3 rather than just the 2 from the previous one. This one's an interesting one. We get this idea of that I became less comfortable. And I've chosen this quotation, I suppose, really to represent several quotations that show how Arthur's journey goes from comfortable to less comfortable. That the pathetic fallacy once again is used when we hear the environment is cold, that the rain comes back, the wind is howling. And this is just the particular quotation that I chose. There are dozens of them throughout that chapter, and really it's how those quotations build from the nice, pleasant journey that Arthur has to something else. And this bit here, which says, "But if you think you've escaped the fogs by coming up here, you're mistaken." And if it was filmed like the children, what? No, there are no children that we've been told of, or whatever it is that Mr. Bentley says in the previous chapter with a bell tolling in the background. This idea of, if you think you've escaped the fogs by coming up here, you're mistaken, says Mr. Daley. And it's a massive neon sign saying warning, flashing on and off to Arthur that look out, the mist's going to get you. And again, sea frets, oh yes, they roll up just from one minute to the next. And he talks about the dramatic suddenness of the frets, and surprise, surprise, that's a key moment in the novel. And again, it's this idea of embedding it in language and just dropping that foreshadowing in there that we kind of miss because we move on to something else and then to something else and then to something else. And Susan Hill's skill is by burying the foreshadowing in there, but moving away from it before we really get time to contemplate this. A skill that is deployed fairly widely and thoroughly throughout the novel. And then this nice line here, "Come," I said, smiling, "you're not going to start telling me strange tales of lonely houses." And then then Samuel looks directly at Arthur and says, "No," he said at last, "I am not. I'm not going to tell you strange tales. I won't do it. There are strange tales, but they are not for me to speak of." This idea of the conspiracy of silence. You could argue maybe at this stage we might think, oh, Samuel Daley doesn't really believe in these things. But actually, we later on learn that there is a method of dealing with the situation that the people of Crith and Gifford find themselves in, which means that they just don't speak of what's occurring. So there you go. There it is, chapter 3. The last of the setups before we get Arthur to the place where the bulk of the story happens. Again, just a reminder, keep up with your notes, keep tracking these techniques as they go along. This chapter we've seen the pathetic fallacy being employed, foreshadowing, and we've met a really significantly important character. Okay, thank you very much, guys, for listening, and I hope you find this video useful.